Well, it's been a quiet week in Lake Wobegon, Minnesota, my hometown, out there on the edge of the prairie. It's been quiet because it's been frozen up tight. It's down to 30 below zero the other night with a high of 2 below in the day. And that is cold. I tell you, people move slowly. Brain function reduced in cold weather. The brain tends to retract like the brain of the turtle who is sleeping down in the mud under the ice in the pond. A near-death experience for him, his body almost at freezing, his little heart beating slowly down there with the fish hibernating like the squirrel, like the bear, and like many people in Lake Wobegon too, in a state of suspended animation. Nobody is talking about global warming this winter in Lake Wobegon. That has been put aside for the time being. Of course, it's nothing like it was. It used to be much, much colder in my childhood. Young people don't remember when it was really cold back then, but I certainly remember 30 below, 40 below was pretty common for us. 50, 60 below, we'd put on a scarf and a hat. 100 below, we had to take precautions. No, there are fewer and fewer people who remember back when winter was really, really cold. Just a few people. I have this feeling now that I'm one of the last to remember. Young people don't believe it because, you see, they didn't keep accurate temperatures back then the way that they do now. The Weather Service put their thermometer for the official reading up alongside the shack where the weathermen lived, you see, because they didn't want to have to walk too far to get the temperature. So they put it right there alongside the window so they could look out and see it. And that building was not very well insulated, and so when they told us on the radio that it was 15 degrees below zero, we knew that was just poor insulation. That was heat from the building that was warming the thermometer. It was 100 degrees below zero. It was very, very cold. Very cold when I grew up in Lake Wobegon. We didn't cancel school, of course. We didn't believe in that, but it was so cold that you could not take up new material. You just did review. That's all you did. The outreach committee at the Lutheran Church pretty much closed up. It was too cold for outreach, really. Men's Bible study, they still held it, but in the book of Job, I believe, and sometimes just a couple people would come for Wednesday night Bible study. They just open the Bible and they just look at it and think about it. Too cold to talk about it, really. Mr. Swenson in physics, I remember, once boiled water in a pan in the physics classroom, and then he threw the boiling water out an open window, and we could hear it tinkle as ice cubes when it hit the ground. I forget just which principle of physics he was proving, but it was interesting. No, it was cold. We'd go to bed in our clothes. Too cold to go to bed otherwise. The bedroom was not heated in the house that I grew up in. If you wet the bed, you died. You'd die, that's all. So you just didn't. You wore your clothes, and gradually the bed warmed up, and you lay there in your little trench, and your mother called to you. She called, "Get up, get out, you lazy lout, get up, you lazy sinner. We need the sheets for tablecloths, it's almost time for dinner." And you'd get up and go downstairs, and there'd be breakfast, oatmeal, sit at the table. Window was all frosted over. Couldn't even see outside. We heated with natural gas, but it got too cold for natural gas to flow, so we had to use coal instead. Coal would all freeze up. If it got wet, you had to bash at it with a pickup, with a pickaxe. I suppose sometimes you'd use a pickup if it got really cold. If you couldn't bash apart the coal, we just had to break up furniture, that's all. We just had to get our fuel wherever we could, go out and get tires or something, just whatever, just keep the house warm. I used to sit and eat my oatmeal and wait for my dad to call me to come help him start the car, which was one of my big jobs, and the other one was taking care of the old Norwegian bachelor farmer who lived out the end of our property. We lived out the edge of town. Crazy Eric lived off in a little shack over there. He's kind of a wiry guy with a beard and kind of balding on the top, and fairly normal in warm weather. You know, he'd get cleaned up and dressed and go to church and everything, but winter just seemed to bring out something primitive in him, and he wouldn't bathe for the whole winter, and he'd revert to speaking Norwegian entirely. Because he was deaf, you see, so he couldn't hear which language he was speaking. He just switched over to Norwegian. I guess it was easier for him. He was deaf because he'd go out at all hours of day and night and go cross-country skiing. Being Norwegian, he was crazy that way. Of course, they couldn't afford the equipment that you have now. He would put 2x4s on his feet, and for bindings, he would use these coyote leg traps. And he'd put his feet in there, had no ski poles, but he used 2 shotguns. He had a shotgun in each hand, skiing across the country. We took him on as an act of Christian charity, and I was sent to look after him every morning just to see he was okay, although in his case, okay was a relative term. I could hear him sometimes singing in his shack as I came up there, singing, "Ye den steal a yon you are, in 2x4. I'd walk up to the house and I'd call out, "Fred, Fred," which is Norwegian for peace. Because he did kind of get riled up sometimes in the wintertime, being deaf the way he was on account of going out skiing without any protection on his ears. And he'd come looking horrible out to the door, look at me, peer out at me. "Vemity, see Vemity. It's me. Just me. Konamai," I said. Breath smelled terrible. I was drinking something that smelled like fermented molasses. Something smelled like animals had died in it. Horrible, horrible. I'd bring him a little coffee. I was sent to help him because I could run faster than the others. I ran home when I got warmed up, and then I waited for my dad to call me to come help start the car, which of course was frozen solid. He had to take coals out of the furnace and put them under the engine block to thaw it up, just so the crankcase oil would start to move a little bit. We used to have a garage, but we used it for fuel, so here sat the car, just frozen as could be. I'd open up the door on the driver's side. They chose me to get behind the steering wheel, you know, to start the car because I was the right size. Opened up this door, frozen, and made this terrible screeching sound. When I opened it, such a terrible sound that the icicles fell off the eaves of the house. These were 45-pound icicles. They were shaped like daggers. We were a family of 8. We had been a family of 11, but never mind that. Don't weep for me. We had a lot of kids back then in that cold, cold weather. Always the birth rate went up. Because, you know, couples would look at each other on a Friday night and they'd say, "Well, do you want to go out to the movies or what?" And they would choose, "or what?" So people had babies in the fall. Some of them had more than one. I'd go out when my dad called me. Now, we had so many kids in our family. For years, he called me Vern. I have no idea why. Then for years, I was Harold. So you had to pay attention. Well, as soon as he got that engine block thawed out, why, I'd have to go out and get in behind the wheel of that car so they could start it. He and my older brother would push that car, and we lived on a rise there, just not far from the river. We were on a ride, so they'd push that car, and he would get going down the hill, and you had to pop the clutch at just the right moment after you had pumped the gas just the right number of times. And if you did it just right, it would start. And if you didn't do it right, it would stop with a big jerk there at the bottom of the hill, and he'd have to go to the neighbor's, Mr. Wick, who had a pickup truck and would come over with the jumper cables and help us get started. And so we would be indebted to a Catholic, which we did not care for. This was no small matter. I was 13 years old. I got in behind the wheel of the car, just frozen shut. The seats cracked when you knelt down on the upholstery. It was so cold. I got in there. My dad said, it's easy now. He said, it's easy. Just let out the clutch when I tell you and pump the gas. That car was aimed towards the bottom of the hill, and I got in that car, and I was just shaking hard as I could shake. I was sitting there, could just barely see over the steering wheel, and then I couldn't see anything because the inside of the windshield got all frosted over. All frosted. I got my foot down on the gas pedal, ready for them to push. Well, they pushed and they pushed and they pushed. And by the time they got that car to move, that window was just covered with frost. I put the side of my fist up on it to thaw a little hole. It made like a little footprint of an elf there on the frost. And I could just see a little bit like looking out through a periscope. And then with a great crack, the car came loose from where it had been frozen to the ground, and it started to roll. It rolled down the hill. The shocks, of course, were frozen, so it was bumping along. This was before seatbelts, children. There were no seatbelts. I was just hanging on to the steering wheel, and then my foot came off the gas pedal, and just then my dad said, start it, let out the clutch. Well, I couldn't find the gas pedal, and I was looking down there for it. I couldn't see out through the windshield, and then suddenly it started to really bump. It was bucking like a bronco, and I realized I was off the driveway, and I was going down the embankment toward the Mississippi River. Rocks under this car was rocking back and forth. I thought my fillings were going to shake out. It just was rocking back and forth. I could see trees coming by on either side. We're going faster and faster. I just prayed. There was no time to even think of words. It was just pure prayer. Oh! I got towards the bottom of the embankment, I guess, and I just let out the clutch, and it started up with a big roar, and I drove out. I was on the ice. I was on the Mississippi River. I started to drive down river. I didn't dare stop for fear it would die. I just kept driving. It would veer off to the left. It would veer off to the right. We'd skid this way. We'd skid that way. We'd go up on the right bank. I'd steer it off. We'd come up on the left bank. The river is narrower down there. We'd run across an island in between trees. It just kept going. I just kept going faster and faster. I had no idea what was going to happen to me. And then I heard somebody yelling, "Haul up!" It was Norwegian for stop. I looked off to the side. Here was old crazy Eric. He was skiing alongside the car on his two. And here he had the shotguns in both hands, and his feet were in the leg traps, and he was skiing for all he was worth, going 30, 35 miles an hour down that river. Well, I took my foot off the gas then and slowed down, brought it to a stop. Boy, it was running good as it could possibly be. He got out of his skis and got into the car on the passenger seat, and I just drove along, looking out the side of the window so I could see where I was going. Boy, I felt good. I'd never driven a car this far before. At the age of 13, we're driving along, looking for some road where we could drive up, get off the river, but after a while, we just kind of forgot about it. We drove down through Minneapolis, and we drove through St. Paul, going down the river. Boy, it was beautiful. He was all excited, and he was talking a mile a minute in Norwegian. I didn't understand much. And then I heard him talk about New Orleans. He talked about New Orleans. Hey, there's smoke, Kevin. Hey, they're flot. Hey, they're flot. Oh, I could tell he'd enjoyed how he'd ever come to New Orleans. I had no idea, but he was talking about, they smaker so good. New Orleans, the South. That was the first I ever heard about New Orleans, was listening to an old drunken Norwegian talk about it in Norwegian on the coldest winter day, talking about New Orleans, snot frozen to his mustache. Thought, someday I'm going to see that city, find out what this is all about. Well, we finally got back home anyway. We drove back home, drove up the driveway, got up to the top of the hill, got up there, and just about then ran out of gas. But that's a whole other story. No, that was a winter when I was 13. You really ought to venerate people like me, because I remember things that nobody else remembers. Historian. That's the news from Lake Wobegon. For all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, all the children are above average.